Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Scope 3 Instruments Navigating Market-Based Solutions. This is the first of 3 webinars in our series titled SBTi Net Zero Consultation, What Businesses Need to Know. So thank you for joining us today as we explore key updates from the Science Based Targets Initiative and explore what these updates mean for corporate climate strategies ongoing. So first, a bit of background. The SBTi launched a consultation on its updated corporate net zero standard, and this introduced important changes that will shape how companies address their climate impact. Over the course of this 3-part series, we'll dive into 3 critical areas: Scope 3 instruments, which is the topic of today, beyond value chain mitigation and neutralisation on May 7th, and then finally we have one on climate transition plans towards the end of May. Today, we're kicking off with a focus on Scope 3 decarbonisation. As companies work to reduce emissions across their value chains, market-based solutions like supply-led approaches and book and claim systems are emerging as potential tools to accelerate progress. But how do these instruments fit into credible net zero strategy? The latest SBTi draft guidance sheds light on this question, offering insights into the role of these mechanisms in corporate emissions reduction plans. However, as these approaches gain traction, important questions arise about their credibility, effectiveness, and how they align with best practices in emissions accounting. In this 30-minute session, we'll break down the key concepts behind supply shed and book and claim systems, helping you understand how these market-based instruments work, their potential role in reducing Scope 3 emissions, and how they are being treated in the SBTi's latest guidance. Firstly, a bit of housekeeping. So you are all muted and will be for the duration of this session. Please post any questions in the Q&A box. We'll have some time to answer questions at the end, but if we don't get to your questions, we'll reach out to you afterwards via email. And finally, this session will be recorded and sent to anyone who has registered. Next slide. So today you'll hear from Lyra. She's a principal consultant in our climate advisory team. You'll also hear from Kimberly Pelosis, a managing consultant also in our climate advisory team. And I'm Anna Hendricks, a sustainability advisor working across both our climate advisory and certificates business line. I hope you enjoyed today's session. I'll hand over to Kimberly. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. So we'll start off by touching on the new draft of the corporate net zero standard. For those who aren't familiar with the SBTi, this slide provides an introduction to the Science Based Targets Initiative. And currently, the SBTi is revising their corporate net zero standard, recently publishing the first draft of version 2 for public consultation, as Anna's mentioned earlier. The next phase of this version 2 standard is the consultation survey, Q&A webinar, and convening expert working groups. In terms of timeline, from 2030 onwards, companies must set new targets using version 2, and existing near-term targets remain valid until 2030 or their end date, whichever comes first. So in this draft, we see a few revisions, with 3 themes as an overview of changes. First involves company categorization based on size and geography to facilitate inclusion of emerging markets. And this involves changes to near-term target setting and target composition. Second, we see a new validation model with an end-to-end framework and a focus on implementation. And the third theme revolves around beyond value chain mitigation activities and removals. Now, in terms of how this links to Scope 3 instruments, Scope 3 emissions reduction is seen as the most significant challenge in net zero target setting. The revision of the corporate net zero standard would aim to address these challenges by enhancing accountability and providing greater clarity on substantiating progress. Today, we'll explore where Scope 3 reductions take place and delve into the 2 instruments set by the new draft. These 2 instruments are the supply shed projects, which is direct mitigation, and the book and claim system, which is indirect mitigation. Now, both of these instruments fall under insetting. So we'll be introducing you to the concept of insetting, followed by a deeper dive into the 2 instruments. So what is insetting and why does it matter? There are many definitions of insetting from various standards. And in terms of how South Pole defines insetting, insetting is an emission reduction or carbon removal project directly linked to the supply chain or the production landscape. For this webinar, we'll focus on the supply chain. So when a project occurs in a company's supply chain, these can also be called on-farm interventions, supply shed projects, or adjacent farmlands. And all of these types of projects could count towards Scope 3 reductions or removals, and therefore could count towards a company's near or long-term science-based target. And why is insetting relevant? Insetting helps to meet targets. It helps companies address their Scope 3 emissions, which often comprise the majority of their total greenhouse gas emissions. Also, designing and implementing projects within your value chain can drive innovation and accelerate net zero progress. Aligned with the proper carbon standards, insetting can be scaled and expanded across suppliers and regions, increasing supply chain resilience, greater control and oversight, thus providing a competitive advantage and improved brand reputation. In terms of collective impact, insetting also enables co-claiming of carbon benefits within the same supply shed or farm level, encouraging collaboration with supplier and producer and tackling emissions at the source. This slide lists some of the ways in which companies can align their Scope 3 strategies with net zero commitments. And I'll pass it on to Lara to delve into the supply shed and book and claim instruments. Over to you, Lara.
Thank you, Kimmy, for that introduction. And what we're going to do now is we'll take a deeper look at these two instruments that are mentioned in the new draft of the SBTi guidance. We'll try to understand what these mean, how they can be used. We'll look at some of the pros and cons of deploying them. And then finally, and very importantly, we'll take a look at some of the methods that can be used to ensure integrity of these instruments and integrity of the claims that we would make based upon them. So before we dig into these instruments of supply shed and book and claim, let's try to understand the structure of a supply shed, the structure of a value chain, and where these instruments would be used, where these kind of projects would sit. And let's think of an agriculture or a food-related company as a very intuitive example, although these would apply to companies across sectors. But as an example, let's think maybe of a company in the coffee sector, right? So one level of granularity that they may be able to achieve in their Scope 3, in their supply chain, is to the farm level. Maybe there are some companies who are able to really trace right up to the specific farm. The farmers who are producing this product work directly with those farmers to reduce emissions that happen during production on the farm. Now, more realistically, however, that level of traceability is very challenging, not only in the agricultural sector, but across sectors in any of the industries that all of you may be from. So this is the area that the SBTi is trying to address in the new draft, the space where companies may not have traceability right up till the farm level, right up till the specific supplier or land management unit. So firstly, let's look at what the supply shed approach is in this kind of situation. So moving on, in the next slide, we'll see that a supply shed is defined as a geographical area with similar conditions, with similar characteristics from where a company sources its materials and products. So going back to our example of our coffee company, they may not know which is the specific farm or farmer that their product is coming from, but maybe they're sourcing from a cooperative, which is aggregating product from multiple farms in the same region. Or maybe they're sourcing from a distributor or a processing company, which is again aggregating product from multiple farms. So this area across which the product is aggregated, it has a physical link to the supply chain. This is known as a supply shed. Very important to note that there is a physical link to the supply chain. So the company may not be able to identify the individual farms or farmers, but they do definitely know that they are sourcing from this geographical area. And the SBTi draft defines a supply shed as a direct mitigation instrument. And when you read through the draft, you'll see these terms coming up: direct mitigation and indirect mitigation. Essentially, what we mean by direct mitigation in the draft is that any actions that are taken within the supply chain will create real and measurable reductions in a company's GHG Scope 3 emissions, because these are the emissions that can be attributed to the suppliers, to the activities that are physically involved in a company's supply chain. Now, moving on, how would this supply shared approach work? So the point and the thinking behind the supply shared approach is that it would allow companies to focus their emission reduction efforts at the level of a sourcing region. So as we all know, in many cases, finding traceability right down to the individual farm or the individual supplier, if you're in a non-agricultural sector, can really be very challenging. And it does expend a lot of time and effort and energy trying to achieve that level of traceability and then verify and substantiate any reductions that are made at that level. The supply shared approach brings this back into a little more practical and realistic approach, because now companies would be allowed to focus on the sourcing region, even if they don't have full traceability right up to the individual supplier or the individual farmer, the individual land management unit. The SBTi new draft standard allows companies to take action within the supply shared level of traceability in cases where direct traceability to the specific emission sources is not available. So the overall thinking is that it allows us to focus our efforts on the areas that we know are material to our supply chain and material to our overall emissions footprint. And moving on ahead from this, as we saw in the earlier slides, the focus of the new draft is to accelerate Scope 3 decarbonization. So how does this approach tie into that objective? Well, essentially in 3 points. So firstly, it allows for activity pool level of interventions. And again, once you read the draft, you will see this nomenclature of activity pool coming up several times. This is pretty similar to the concept of a supply shed. It essentially refers to a pool or an area or essentially a specific geography or specific activity, a set of activities that the company knows are tied to their supply chain. So it allows the company to focus at an activity pool level by reducing emissions in the areas that it knows are most material, and in cases where traceability to the specific source at the most granular level is not available. Secondly, if we are taking this approach, there are obviously going to be differences in the type of data and the type of information that every company has. So the new approach in the draft allows for flexibility in reporting, allows for different validation methods, as long as those can be substantiated, as long as those are backed up by evidence. It does provide us options to deal with the issues of data quality and traceability that we always run into when working on Scope 3. And finally, this is really interesting. The updated draft allows options for non-emission metrics. And most interestingly, this is related to engaging with tier one suppliers, engaging with suppliers who are on their own net zero and decarbonization journey, quantifying the percentage or the share of our procurement that comes from these suppliers, and essentially working closely with our tier one suppliers to drive faster and more effective decarbonization methods. Moving ahead, of course, this approach comes with its own pros and cons, which is really important for us to be aware of as we weigh into the draft for those of you who would like to participate in the SBTi process, and as we start thinking about this instrument going ahead. So firstly, simplified traceability. We've touched on this a couple of times. In cases where a company doesn't have traceability to the individual supplier or the individual farm or the individual unit, it doesn't prevent us from taking action, because we can still take action at the supply shared or the activity pool level. That comes along with lower monitoring costs in several cases, because it no longer requires us to have traceability right up to the individual unit. Of course, it does not mean that there is no monitoring, and we'll come to that when we speak about safeguards. And finally, the third pro or the third benefit is a reduced risk of reversal. So this is something that has been a long-standing area of discussion, which is, let's say if you're working with a pool of suppliers or with a specific supplier, and that supplier pulls out and they're no longer part of our value chain, what happens to all of the work that is done with them? that has been done with them. So with the supply share approach, that risk is mitigated somewhat because we are less focused on working with individual suppliers and more focused on working with a supply shed, with an activity pool that we know is physically linked to our supply chain. On the flip side, naturally there are risks, and related to that last point, the risk that comes along with this reduced reversals is the risk of leakage and permanence. So on the flip side, let's say if a supplier or an individual supplier, multiple suppliers do pull out of our value chain, or they stop implementing the project, or their implementation of the project is less than effective and the reductions are less than what we expected, there is a risk of leakage, which means we lose some of the carbon benefits, or permanence, which means they no longer persist. And that has to be accounted for with safeguards put into place. That comes along with the risk of double counting, because let's say if there are multiple companies sourcing from the same supply shed, we want to make sure that we are not overclaiming or overestimating the reductions that all of those companies can claim. And then finally, this approach does require us to lean on third-party verifications, on third-party assurances to make sure that those claims are verified, that they can be backed up, and that there is integrity to the reductions that they're claiming. So in short, moving ahead on that point of the actions that we can take to ensure integrity when we're using the supply share approach, the first and the closest to all of us in any industry, wherever you might be, whichever sector you might be working with, is enhancing those supplier relationships, especially when we're working with tier one suppliers. There are always existing relationships that can be leveraged, their own projects that can be built upon, and reporting that already exists can be enhanced, and data sharing can be enhanced. So building our existing supplier relationships is definitely one strong way of ensuring integrity. Implementing a robust MRV plan for measurement, reporting, and verification. This refers back to some of the things we spoke about in the last slide, which is making use of third-party verifiers, making use of third-party standards wherever available. And similar to that is aligning with safeguards. So for example, the draft land sector and removals guidance describes a variety of safeguards in using the supply share approach, for example, making sure that we can prove the link to the supply chain, making sure that there is still a certain level of traceability, making sure that there is some level of physical linkage. And then finally, as we spoke about before, similar to the previous points, leveraging third-party certifications, aligning with best practices, and making sure that the claims that an individual company is making and the claims that multiple companies are making, if they're sourcing from the same area, that all of those can be substantiated and that they're genuine, and at the end of the day, that we are actually achieving that real Scope 3 decarbonization. So this is instrument one that is discussed in the new draft. Let's move on and look at the second instrument, which is the book and claim system. Now, there may be instances where we don't even have that level of traceability, that we can say that a certain activity or a reduction in a certain activity is physically linked to our value chain. However, we may know that certain activities are related to the decarbonization of value chains as a whole, but it still may be a struggle in complex sectors or in very complex and large supply chains to have even that supply share level of visibility. So the book and claim system, which is discussed in the draft, allows or potentially allows companies to purchase certificates related to commodities. These would be certificates that represent emission reductions from sustainable practices which may be achieved elsewhere, which we still know are linked to the value chain in some way, and which companies would be able to claim under this proposed approach. So the SBTi looks at book and claim as an indirect mitigation approach. Now, if you recall what we spoke a few minutes ago, the supply share approach is a direct mitigation approach. It is definitively linked to our supply chain. We know that this is a geography, or this is a pool of activities that are linked to our supply chains. In this case, the book and claim approach, we may not have that level of visibility, so it's classed as an indirect mitigation approach. Very important to note that the new draft discusses the book and claim system as an interim measure, so there still would be discussions that this is subject to. There would be refinements of the guidance, and overall, the SBTi continues to emphasize direct mitigation measures with these kind of indirect mitigation measures as a second option, as a supporting option. So how would this book and claim system be used. The two examples that we do know of, which are mentioned in the draft, are an example related to the shipping and transportation industry. So the draft mentions sustainable aviation fuel as a really obvious example. So there could be a case where companies may be allowed to purchase certificates related to the use of sustainable fuels and book and claim it in that manner. The other potential use of it could be commodity certificates. This would be very relevant, let's say, to an agriculture and food related sector where there may be commodities that are certified, there may be volumes that are certified that companies cannot directly link back to their supply chains, but we do know that overall these are measures that are contributing towards the net zero transition, they're contributing towards decarbonization, and this mechanism would potentially allow companies to access it. Of course, subject to the caveats that this would be possibly a time-limited interim measure and would be second priority compared to direct mitigation. So as we did for the supply chain, let's look at supply shed, sorry, let's look at some of the pros and cons of this approach. The first really interesting one is that it would allow companies that do not have direct access to that physical product, which is associated with an environmental benefit. Companies would still be able to trade it and claim those benefits of that product, even if they don't have direct access to it. What this does is that it leads into the second benefit. It allows for flexibility. It allows for companies to engage with more options to decarbonize their supply chain and strengthen the volumes of these products in the system, strengthen the entire discussion around decarbonizing some of these more complex commodities. And finally, it's highly scalable, not only within the same company, but also across different companies that may be procuring similar commodities, and is an encouragement for the sector to build those kind of sustainable volumes of products. On the flip side, of course, comes the data management complexity, because in this kind of system, unlike the supply shed, we don't have physical traceability to those suppliers or to those specific volumes. So there is quite a strong need to ensure that the data and the certificates that are being traded and claimed are verifiable and are properly tracked. Along with that, as we're speaking of any type of certification, comes the implication that there are costs involved. And then finally, the risk of double counting would need to be mitigated, especially if there are multiple companies that are claiming a limited amount of certified volume or that are claiming similar types of similar certificates. So these are some of the pros and cons that we would keep an eye on and which we can expect more guidance on as the draft version gets refined. And to ensure integrity while using this system, the first requirement is that we would need to look at using certified, verifiable, and reliable certificates. We want to make sure that any certified volumes are based in something that can be evidence that's really leading to a real decarbonization and that is transparent, is ensuring accountability for all of the companies involved. Secondly is the accessibility of evidence. And what this means is that a third party, like let's say the SBTi, or maybe a regulatory body, or maybe a customer who wants to understand where this claim is coming from, should be able to review and access the evidence based on which a company is making claims on a book and claim system. So transparency and accessibility of the evidence becomes really important in this scenario. And then finally, aligning with best practices and standards, whether those are sustainability related claims like ICO, for example, or the requirements of the SBTi or requirements of local regulators. So that's a very quick and high level summary of the two instruments discussed in this draft, the supply shed and the book and claim system. We'll take a very quick look at some of the elements related to navigating the new SBTi draft, which I'm sure a lot of people are going to do with great excitement in the coming days. So the next steps as this progresses is regulatory alignment. So when you look at the draft, you'll see that it constantly refers back to making sure that supply share instruments and book and claim systems comply with the relevant region-specific standards, region-specific legal requirements to make sure that all of the actions that we are taking are aligned to the geographies and the frameworks that companies are located in. Secondly, stakeholder consultation, and we touched on this a little earlier. The draft is now going to go into the phase of discussion. There's going to be an SBTi webinar or survey that you can use to send your feedback in, all of which are available on the website. So do go and check that out. And then finally, placeholder criteria or maybe interim criteria. So really important to understand that while these options are exciting, these options allow for a more targeted scope 3 action, there still needs to be some amount of discussion and refinement before these are put into practice. So all of these criteria that we've looked at today are subject to discussion, and we can look forward to more refinement in the coming weeks. So finally, before we move on to questions, if there are two takeaways that you remember from the session, one would be the movement towards stronger safeguards. So while we have potentially these additional instruments at hand now to support our decarbonization work, those come along with the requirement for stronger safeguards to make sure that all of the claims we are making can be evidenced, can be traceable, and are leading to real decarbonization that will take us as industries, as companies, as a sector, as a planet towards our net zero goals. And then finally, a hierarchy of action. So this is an interesting move when it comes to understanding and working on scope 3, that the new direction seems to be to focus on the most material sources of emissions, to focus on our tier 1 suppliers where we have the closest relationships and ability to influence, and also to focus on the most emission intensive activities in our supply chains. So with that, I'm sure there are quite a few questions, and we'll hand back to Anna, who will take us through some of the questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Lara. That was a really great summary. So we don't have a lot of time for questions, but I'll dive in. So the first one we have here is, how does the SBTi frame the shift in focusing on certain scope 3 emissions categories under the update? This might be a good one for you, Lara.
Yes. So part of this we've touched on before, and part of this we can talk about a little more now. So companies are encouraged to focus on the scope 3 categories that represent 5% or more of their total scope 3 emissions. So how this differs from the earlier approach or the current approach is that we are focused right now, while setting targets, on a certain percentage to achieve the minimum target boundary. So for scope 3, it would be 67%, whereas with the new approach, what potentially we would be looking at is focusing on the most material sources of emissions and the most emissions intensive activities. And secondly, in order to address them, companies are encouraged to look at areas where they have the greatest influence. And this is something that has come up time and time again for every company who's decarbonizing their scope 3. It can be a challenge to identify the areas that you can actually make a difference on. So focusing on the tier 1 suppliers where we have direct relationships and direct influence is another opening and another interesting direction that the new guidance is going in.
Great, thanks for that one, Lara. And we have another one. This might be good for you, Kimmy. So how can companies with complex value chains engage with their suppliers to support the transition to net zero?
Thanks, Anna. Very good question. In terms of companies with complex value chains, I guess pending consultation, supplier engagement targets may be required for all of a company's tier 1 suppliers. The goal of these targets would be to increase the portion of tier 1 suppliers by spend that are either in the process of transitioning to net zero aligned practices or have transitioned to a level of performance compatible with net zero. So what that means is engaging with suppliers today creates more of a potential for better collaborative impact in the future.
Great, thanks for that, Kimmy. That's probably all we have time for today, but thanks for listening and for sending through your questions. Any that we haven't gotten through to today, we'll write up a response and reach out to you, but also please feel free to reach out and we can set up a time to call, set up a call to answer any questions. But yeah, for those of you who aren't familiar with who South Pole is, we're a global climate solutions company specialising in climate sustainability, nature and carbon markets. We've been around for 20 years and we bring this deep experience into everything that we do. We're a leading consultancy on topics such as Scope 3, climate risk, target setting, and we're also a seller of environmental certificates such as carbon credits and renewable energy certificates. And globally, we're one of the largest carbon credit asset developers. Yes, we employ over 800 people across the globe, have presences in 30 different countries, and then a really strong regional presence here in APAC. We hope you enjoyed today's session and that you tune in for the remainder 2 sessions that we have across the rest of the month. Great, thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.